The air in our home was not measured in temperature, but in quarterly reports and projected yields. I didn't live in a house. I lived in a beautifully maintained museum dedicated to my parents' relentless efficiency. Every piece of antique furniture, every meticulously curated painting, every silent, polished expanse of mahogany floor was a testament to the idea that life was a complex financial equation. And I was their most significant, and currently failing, investment. I had spent 18 years absorbing the unspoken curriculum of the Rourke dynasty. Success was quantifiable. It was the acceptance letter from Yale, the internship at Goldman Sachs, the strategically advantageous marriage, and the ability to discuss bond futures with the same casual ease others discussed the weather. My existence was predicated on maintaining a flawless return on investment, ROI, for my lineage. The pressure wasn't a sudden burst of anger. It was a constant, low-level atmospheric hum, like a distant, industrial machine that never powered down. It manifested as the tightness in my chest when my father asked about my SAT scores, or the way my mother would subtly guide my conversations at the country club, ensuring I presented the perfect blend of intellectual prowess and demure ambition. I was a perfectly packaged product, ready for market, and the market was Wall Street. My anxiety was a quiet, suffocating companion. I understood the path laid out for me was paved with gold, but the walls of that path were closing in, and I couldn't breathe. I knew, deep down, that if I followed their script, I would spend my life calculating other people's worth, while never discovering my own. The decision had not been impulsive. It was a slow, agonizing realization, forged over months of staring at application essays I couldn't bring myself to write. I had looked at the Ivy League brochures, all those smiling, ambitious faces, and felt nothing but dread. I craved real hardship, real purpose, something that couldn't be bought or traded. I craved the kind of responsibility that involved more than moving digital money around the globe. The dinner table announcement the night I delivered the news. The setting was, as always, immaculate. We were seated at the 12-foot-long dining table, a relic of English aristocracy that dominated the room. The chandelier overhead cast a sterile, yellow glow on the heavy silver and the crystal glasses, each perfectly aligned. Our conversation, such as it was, revolved around the imminent merger of one of my father's portfolio companies. I waited until the dessert plates, a delicate lavender sorbite, had been set before us. I remember the precise sound of the silver spoon scraping against the porcelain as my mother took her first bite. I cleared my throat, a sound that felt deafening in the formal silence. "I have something to tell you," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the earthquake rumbling beneath my ribs. My father paused, raising a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. He didn't look up from contemplating his sorbet. "Yes, Sarah. Have you finally decided between Columbia and Yale?" I took a breath, anchoring myself to the cold reality of the moment. "I'm not applying to either. I'm not going to college right now." My mother's spoon slipped from her fingers, hitting the plate with a sharp, sickening clink. The sound resonated through the room, louder and more disruptive than any shouting could have been. My father finally looked up. His expression wasn't rage. It was worse. It was the look of a financier discovering a catastrophic, unrecoverable loss. "Elaborate," he commanded, his tone dangerously flat. It wasn't a request. It was an order for data. "I enlisted," I said, the word feeling oddly foreign and powerful on my tongue. "I signed the papers last week. I leave for boot camp in 3 months. I'm joining the Navy." The silence that followed was immense. It was the heaviest silence I had ever experienced, loaded with the weight of generations of expectations suddenly shattered. My mother stared at the spilled sorbet on the pristine tablecloth, her hand trembling slightly. My father placed his napkin neatly beside his plate. His movements were always deliberate, always controlled. "The Navy," he repeated, savoring the word as if it were a foreign contaminant. "You chose the Navy, a military path. Sarah, you are aware that we have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars ensuring you would never have to pursue a path that relies on state funding or physical labor. Are you not?" I met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "I am aware, Father. But I need to earn something that isn't measured in dollars." His response was immediate, brutal, and delivered with the cold precision of a skilled surgeon making a calculated cut. "Earn? What exactly do you think you will earn there? Scars? A pension that barely covers minimum wage? You have been given every tool, every connection, every opportunity to enter the arena of real power. The power of Capellan. You are choosing to run away. You are choosing a path for those who couldn't handle real responsibility." His words cut deeper than any emotional outburst. He painted my decision not as service, not as a choice of duty, but as a cowardly escape from the intellectual rigors of high finance. In his eyes, I was not serving my country. I was admitting defeat in the only game that mattered. This is a waste of potential. Sarah, he continued, his voice rising slightly. The first crack in his composure. It is a profound disappointment. You are squandering the most valuable asset you possess, your intellect, and your pedigree on a trajectory that leads nowhere but obscurity. My mother finally found her voice, though it was strained and high-pitched. Her concern wasn't for my safety or my future happiness. It was entirely focused on the social fallout. The miller's daughter just got into Stanford Law, she whispered, her eyes wide with panic. How am I supposed to explain this at the club? My daughter is going through a phase. No, I can't. This is mortifying. You are ruining your professional network before it even starts. Do you have any idea how bad this looks? She immediately began managing the crisis, mentally drafting the narrative she would spin to her friends. I wasn't joining the Navy. I was taking a gap year for personal development before starting a highly selective leadership program. She sanitized my sacrifice, reducing my profound, life-altering decision to a temporary, embarrassing hiccup that needed public relations control. I felt a profound, isolating coldness settle over me. They didn't see me. They didn't see the uniform I longed to wear, the discipline I craved, or the purpose I was seeking. They only saw the damage to the Rourke brand. My choice was a profound embarrassment to the family name, a failure of their fundamental parenting strategy. For the next 3 months, the house became a silent battlefield. My father communicated with me only through curt notes regarding logistics, car insurance, bank accounts treating me like a problematic line item he was eager to liquidate. My mother maintained a facade of strained normalcy, inviting friends over, and then conspicuously avoiding any direct mention of my future. Making it clear that Sarah was going through something that was best ignored, I retreated into myself, channeling the deep wound of their dismissal into preparation. I trained physically, pushing myself harder with every run, every repetition, using their scorn as fuel. I needed the raw, determined need to prove them wrong, not to them, but to the person staring back at me in the mirror. The farewell the day I left was overcast, matching the mood. There were no grand farewells, no emotional embraces. My father was conveniently in Zurich on business, calculated absence, I suspected. My mother offered a perfunctory hug that felt more like a social obligation than an act of affection. Just remember, she murmured into my hair, pulling back quickly. When you realize this was a mistake, your father and I will ensure the transition back to civilian life is seamless. We will fix this. She still saw my departure as a temporary illness they would eventually cure. I loaded my meager luggage into the trunk of my old sedan, the only car I was allowed to keep, as it was deemed insufficiently prestigious for their new fleet. I remember looking up at the house one last time. It stood majestic and cold, its stone facade reflecting the morning light, a monument to inherited wealth and suffocating expectation. The pristine, manicured estate looked less like a home and more like an extremely luxurious prison cell. As I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled away from the circular driveway, I noticed the heavy wrought-iron gates closing slowly behind me, locking me out, or perhaps locking them in. I drove 4 miles, watching the landscape shift from the sprawling, manicured lawns of Greenwich to the more honest, rugged reality of the interstate. With every mile that separated me from that gilded cage, I felt a physical sensation of decompression. The weight of their judgment, the constant anxiety of failing to meet the impossible standards of the Rourke name, slowly began to lift. It was replaced by something raw and demanding. Determination. I knew that I was leaving behind not just a house, but an entire identity they had tried to impose on me, the identity of the compliant, financially engineered daughter. My path now was uncertain, potentially dangerous, and definitely low-paying. But for the first time in my life, it was mine. I didn't know what the Navy would make of me, but I knew I was finally free to find out. And I vowed then, driving away from the scorn and the silence, that I would return not for their approval, but armed with undeniable proof that my chosen path had led to a power they could never dismiss. My service was not an escape. It was my true beginning. The sea was calling, and I was ready to taste the salt. Chapter 2. The taste of salt. The ocean had become my true home. A vast, indifferent expanse that asked nothing of me except precision and endurance. 15 years had passed since I traded the suffocating silence of my parents' estate for the controlled chaos of naval service. I was no longer the defiant, wounded girl who drove away from Connecticut. I was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Rourke, logistics and operations specialist, and my uniform was not a costume, it was armor forged in the heat of responsibility. I had earned every stripe, every medal, and every ounce of respect I now commanded. The Navy was my university, my proving ground, and my most reliable family. I learned the true meaning of value, not the abstract, inflated worth of stocks and real estate my father obsessed over, but the concrete life or death value of a perfectly executed supply chain or a flawlessly maintained engine. I knew how to manage multi-million-dollar budgets and coordinate complex global movements. I was a professional, and I was good at my job. But success, I discovered, was a complex beast. It brought confidence, but it also brought a renewed, if foolish, optimism that maybe, just maybe, my achievements had finally bridged the chasm between me and my parents. I was on a rare, extended leave, the kind that only comes after successful high-stakes deployments, and I had accumulated a tidy sum in savings. I decided I would use that money not on a trip around the world, but on a gesture a peace offering wrapped in luxury. I thought, if I could meet them on their own turf, playing by their rules, they might finally see me as more than a social embarrassment. The symbol of their world, the impenetrable bastion of old money and exclusionary privilege, was the Crestwood Resort. It was where my mother held her charity luncheons, where my father closed deals on the 18th hole, and where, growing up, I was taught the cardinal rule: if you had to ask the price, you didn't belong. I remember the nervous energy humming through me as I sat in my temporary apartment, the phone clutched tight in my hand. I had checked the website moments before. Rooms were available. I was aiming for the presidential suite, a splurge designed to scream, asterisk, I am successful. I can afford this. Asterisk, I dialed the number. And the voice on the other end, smooth and overly refined, introduced himself as Mr. Henderson, the resort manager. I recognized the name immediately. He was one of the many impeccably tailored men who populated my father's golf outings and country club committees, the gatekeeper of the Gilded Cage. I introduced myself, giving my full name and stating my desire to book a suite for the upcoming weekend. I kept my tone professional, precise, projecting the confidence I felt when briefing an admiral. Rourke, Mr. Henderson repeated, his voice momentarily pausing, perhaps recognizing the family name. Yes, Ms. Rourke, a pleasure. We are known for our unparalleled service. I explained my requirements, mentioning the specific suite. That's when the shift happened. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cool, almost surgical detachment. And may I ask, Ms. Rourke, the nature of your visit? We often host corporate retreats or, of course, our established family clientele. I hesitated. I could have lied, invented a fictitious corporate merger, but the whole point was honesty, validation. I am currently on leave from the United States Navy, I stated, feeling a surge of pride in the title. I am a logistics officer. I was hoping to spend a quiet, luxurious weekend here. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. It stretched, thin and brittle, across the phone line. The Navy, Mr. Henderson, finally drawled, the word delivered with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. As if I had mentioned sanitation work. I see. Well, Lieutenant Commander Rourke, the Crestwood, prides itself on maintaining a certain exclusive ambience. I felt my jaw tighten. I assure you, Mr. Henderson, my standards for ambience are quite high. I was prepared to pay the full rate for the presidential suite. His tone became subtly dismissive, almost patronizing. It's not a matter of funds, per se. It's about ensuring the expected clientele and the overall tenor of the resort remains consistent. We have very specific expectations for our guests. He launched into a veiled interrogation, asking about my typical leisure activities, my preferred mode of transportation, and who, precisely, I would be entertaining. Every question was designed to subtly undermine the legitimacy of my presence. He was implying that my military background was incompatible with their brand of rarefied snobbery. I knew what he was doing. He was performing a rapid social audit, and my history, my profession, and my lack of inherited social standing were failing the test. The final blow was delivered with a practiced smoothness that suggested he had used this exact line countless times before. Unfortunately, Lieutenant Commander Rourke, I've just had a look at the system. Due to an unforeseen surge in reservations from our most established patrons, we are, regrettably, fully booked for the entire season. We simply cannot accommodate your request at this time. I stared at the computer screen, the bright green availability flashing mockingly at me. It wasn't about being booked. It was about pedigree. The sting was immediate and profound. A deep, burning shame that eclipsed the isolation I had felt 15 years ago. Back then, I was rejected by my family. Now, I was rejected by the very institution they revered. And for the very thing my uniform that had given me worth. I hung up the phone, my hand shaking with a mixture of rage and humiliation. I had been judged and found wanting, not by a hostile enemy, but by a man whose only real job was to manage a glorified hotel. In a moment of desperate weakness, fueled by the lingering need for validation, I called my father. I thought, surely, he would intervene. He knew Henderson. He was a pillar of that community. He would demand they respect his daughter, his successful, high-ranking daughter. I recounted the conversation, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. My father listened, his silence punctuated by the faint clink of ice cubes, probably scotching the other end. When I finished, I waited for the righteous indignation. It never came. Instead, he chuckled. It was a dry, dismissive sound, devoid of warmth or concern. A sound that communicated, "You're being naive, Sarah." "Well, Sarah," he said, his tone annoyingly reasonable. "You have to understand Henderson's position. He's protecting the brand. The Crestwood has a reputation. It's not meant for uniformed personnel." The air left my lungs. "What are you saying, father? That my service makes me unworthy of staying there?" I struggled to keep my voice even. "I'm saying you made a choice 15 years ago," he replied, his voice hardening slightly, moving from amusement to intellectual disappointment. "You chose a path outside the societal parameters we established. You can't expect places like the Crestwood to suddenly alter their entire business model just because you've managed to save up enough deployment money for a weekend. It's about appropriate association, dear. Perhaps you should stick to something more, appropriate to your current station." He was validating the snobbery. He was defending Mr. Henderson's refusal. My service, my discipline, my entire hard-won identity was still, in his eyes, a mark of low status, a regrettable diversion. My mother, who had apparently been listening on speakerphone, chimed in with her usual condescension. "Honestly, Sarah, you're being overly sensitive. It's just a resort. Why make a fuss? You know how these things operate." The realization hit me like a physical blow, worse than any punch I'd taken during training. They hadn't changed. They never would. They didn't see me. They saw only the reflection of their own tarnished social standing. The last fragile thread of hope, the desperate yearning for their validation, snapped completely. I hung up without another word. The silence that followed was not the heavy silence of disappointment, but the cold, clear silence of absolute clarity. I walked out of the apartment, still wearing the crisp, perfectly pressed uniform I had put on earlier, in hopeful anticipation. I drove until I reached the coast. I stood on the boardwalk, looking out at the immense, churning Atlantic. The salt spray misted my face, masking the tears of shame and incandescent rage that were burning in my eyes. I looked down at the uniform that had been my pride, my shelter, and my identity. It was the only thing I owned that was truly mine, earned through sweat and sacrifice, yet it was the very thing that had barred me from their world. That day, I didn't just abandon the hope of their acceptance. I redefined my purpose. The shame was replaced by a sudden, cold, focused resolve. I wouldn't just ignore them. I wouldn't just prove them wrong. I would acquire the financial power necessary to stand above the very institutions that had dismissed me. The Crestwood was not just a resort. It was the physical embodiment of their arrogance, their exclusion, and their outdated belief system. It was the monument to my humiliation, and I decided, standing there with the taste of salt and anger on my tongue, that I would buy it. I would acquire the Crestwood. I would strip it of its snobbery. I would make it a monument to merit, not lineage. This was no longer about proving myself to them. It was about achieving absolute, undeniable control over the symbols of my oppression. I needed to speak the only language they understood: money, power, and final ownership. I turned away from the ocean, the salt drying on my cheeks. The Navy had taught me strategy, discipline, and logistics. Now, I would channel every ounce of that training, every late-night study session on financial markets, every high-stakes decision I had made in deployment, into a singular, unwavering objective. The game had changed. It was no longer a plea for peace. It was a declaration of war, fought with capital and precision. I would become a predator, and the Crestwood, that smug, exclusive sanctuary, was my target. I smiled, a cold, hard expression that felt completely foreign, yet utterly correct. The shame was gone, replaced by a quiet, 15-year vengeance plan. I was armed, focused, and ready to begin the long, slow accumulation of quiet power. The first thing I needed to do was figure out exactly how much a resort like that was worth. and how long it would take to execute the perfect, untraceable strike. The taste of salt from that ocean spray, the same salt that had stung my eyes as I stood outside the Crestwood. Uniform rumpled, heart burning with betrayal, never truly left my palate. It became the flavor of my ambition. The memory of my father's dry chuckle. "That place isn't meant for uniformed personnel," was the precise moment I stopped mourning the loss of their approval and started building an empire they couldn't touch. It wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about achieving a kind of financial and strategic invincibility that rendered their judgment meaningless. I realized then that my rejection wasn't personal. It was institutional. And institutions, I understood, could be bought, controlled, or dismantled. The Navy, which they had dismissed as a cowardly escape, became my unexpected university. While my contemporaries were accumulating debt and learning abstract theories in Ivy-covered lecture halls, I was learning real-world logistics, resource allocation, and high-stakes decision-making under conditions that brooked no failure. My gilded cage upbringing had taught me what wealth looked like. The Navy taught me how power worked. I channeled the searing humiliation into a laser-like focus. I stopped looking at my service as a temporary assignment and started viewing it as a comprehensive 15-year strategic development plan. I didn't just want to be a good sailor. I wanted to master the infrastructure that kept the entire machine running. I immediately sought out roles that dealt explicitly with large-scale operations and financial oversight. I specialized in supply chain management and procurement, the arteries and veins of the military apparatus. I learned that the U.S. Navy, in its complexity, was arguably the single largest, most demanding logistical enterprise in the world. Managing a multi-billion-dollar budget for deployment readiness, optimizing fuel consumption for a carrier group, or coordinating the transport of critical assets across 3 different continents. These were the challenges I tackled daily. They were financial puzzles of a magnitude that dwarfed the quarterly reports my father obsessed over. I remember my first major assignment involving the audit of a massive overseas logistics contract. The numbers were staggering. It wasn't just about balancing a ledger. It was about ensuring operational readiness, which meant lives and national security hung in the balance of my decisions. When I successfully identified and corrected a systemic inefficiency that saved the taxpayer tens of millions of dollars annually, I felt a quiet, profound satisfaction. This was responsibility. This was real power. It was earned, not inherited. During long deployments, while others were playing cards or watching movies, I was devouring financial texts. I read everything I could get my hands on about investment banking, private equity, and the mechanics of large corporate acquisitions. I saw the civilian world not as a distant place, but as a vast, complex landscape waiting to be strategically exploited. I translated military terminology into financial terms. Deployment became market penetration. Resource allocation became capital management. Mission success became ROI. The discipline I developed was absolute. The military structure provided the framework, but my own internal drive provided the engine. I lived frugally, maximizing every benefit the service offered. My entire career was focused on capital accumulation. I treated every paycheck, every bonus, and every housing allowance as a strategic asset. I researched long-term high-yield investments, leveraging the compounding effect of 15 years of focused saving. I utilized the Thrift Savings Plan, TSP, and other specialized investment vehicles with the precision of a sniper. I realized that the truly powerful people in the world, the ones who dictated the rules, like the owners of the Crestwood, didn't chase money. They commanded capital. My goal wasn't merely to be wealthy enough to book a room at that resort. It was to be wealthy enough to own the ground it stood on. There was a stark contrast between my life and the lives of the people who had occupied my past. They measured success by the size of their wine cellar or the exclusivity of their country club membership. I measured success by the complexity of the problems I solved and the sheer volume of assets I controlled. I often thought about my father's peers, the young Wall Street analysts who boasted about their 80-hour work weeks. My 80 hours were spent navigating bureaucratic minefields, managing international crises, and making decisions that carried actual life-or-death consequences. Their pressure was theoretical. Mine was tangible. The years blurred into a relentless pursuit of competence. My rank steadily increased, giving me access to higher-level planning and deeper financial insights. I became an expert in optimization, taking vast, messy systems and making them lean, efficient, and profitable. This skill, I knew, was the golden ticket to the civilian world. I kept my distance from my parents. Phone calls were brief, formal, and strictly transactional. They would occasionally ask, with thinly veiled pity, when I planned to come back to reality. I would simply reply that I was quite busy, and perhaps they wouldn't understand the scope of my current responsibilities. The distance was necessary. I needed to protect the cold, hard ambition that had replaced my pain. Every conversation reinforced the fact that they still saw me through the lens of their outdated expectations. I was still the daughter who had wasted her Yale potential on a uniform. By the time my 15 years were approaching their end, I had achieved a highly respected rank and, more importantly, a financial portfolio that was not just significant, but strategically liquid. I had planned my exit meticulously. I didn't want a conventional retirement. I wanted a launchpad. The transition was seamless. I retired honorably, utilizing my accumulated experience and contacts to establish a private contracting firm. I named it Logos Solutions, a nod to the logic and structure that had defined my life. The firm focused exclusively on supply chain optimization and large-scale operational restructuring for Fortune 500 companies. It was military precision applied directly to civilian corporate chaos. The market was hungry for the kind of disciplined, high-level strategic thinking that the military instills. Companies drowning in inefficiency were desperate for someone who could cut through the noise and deliver results. My reputation preceded me. I didn't need to schmooze at cocktail parties. My track record spoke for itself. I vividly recall the day I signed the contract with my first major client, a massive agricultural conglomerate, struggling with global distribution. The fee alone was more than my father had made in his best year on Wall Street. I sat in my minimalist office, looking at the signature on the document. It wasn't a moment of ecstatic celebration, but one of quiet, profound validation. The money was simply the score, the proof that my path had been the correct one. I had built this. Every cent was earned through blood, sweat, and strategic brilliance. I was no longer Sarah Rourke, the embarrassing daughter. I was the CEO of Logos Solutions, a force in the consulting world, someone who commanded respect purely through merit. 15 years of quiet power had transformed me. The angry, wounded girl who stood outside the Crestwood was gone. She had been replaced by a focused, calculating strategist. I felt detached from the pain of the past, viewing my parents' world not with longing or resentment, but with the cold calculation of an investor assessing a failing asset. It was around this time that I started receiving invitations to exclusive financial summits and high-level corporate retreats, the very circles my parents had once excluded me from. I attended a few, observing the rituals of the elite with clinical interest. They spoke the language of money, but I spoke the language of leverage and acquisition. I was armed, financially and intellectually. My past was a solved problem, and the final piece of the puzzle, the Crestwood, was waiting. I had the patience of a predator, knowing that every institution, no matter how arrogant, eventually shows its weakness. I simply needed to wait for the perfect moment to strike. I was ready to buy back my own dignity, one highly leveraged asset at a time. The game was about to begin. The language of money was secondary to the language of leverage, and I spoke both fluently. I had spent the last 15 years building a fortress of discipline and capital, brick by calculated brick. My past, the humiliation at the hands of my family and the Crestwood, was no longer a fresh wound. It was simply a strategic objective awaiting execution. I was armed, financially and intellectually, and I had the patience of a predator. My office in downtown Manhattan was a study in minimalist power glass, steel, and silence. It was the antithesis of the dark, heavy mahogany and velvet that defined my parents' world. I was sitting at my desk late one Tuesday, poring over a quarterly report on distressed regional luxury assets. My firm, specialized in optimizing supply chains, often scouted businesses that were failing due to gross mismanagement or outdated operational models. That's when I saw the name, nestled in a footnote detailing leveraged debt restructuring, the Crestwood Resort, Long Island, a cold, sharp satisfaction spread through me. It wasn't glee, but the intellectual fulfillment of a hypothesis proven correct. Arrogance, I had always known, was a poor business model. The Crestwood, that gilded anachronism built on snobbery and exclusivity, had failed to modernize. They had relied too heavily on the notion that their blue-blood clientele would sustain them indefinitely, ignoring the rising cost of labor, the shifting demands of modern luxury, and the crippling inefficiency of their operations. I leaned back in my chair, the city lights reflecting in the glass wall behind me. The irony was exquisite. 15 years earlier, Mr. Henderson, the gatekeeper of pedigree, had implied my military background made me unsuitable for their expected clientele. Now, that same institution was drowning in the very cash flow problems my expertise was designed to solve. I immediately initiated the intelligence phase of the operation. This wasn't a casual investment. It was a targeted acquisition. I wanted the Crestwood, and I wanted it quietly. I needed to ensure that no one, especially my parents or Mr. Henderson, would trace the purchase back to Sarah Rourke, the daughter they had dismissed as a wayward embarrassment. I summoned my chief legal counsel, a brilliant but ruthless corporate lawyer named Marcus, and laid out the plan. "We need a phantom," I told him. "A holding company so layered and insulated it looks like a sovereign wealth fund from a small, neutral nation." Marcus, who understood that my goals were rarely purely financial, simply nodded. He knew I was playing a deeper game. Over the next 3 months, Merit Holdings was born a labyrinthine structure designed for absolute anonymity. We began acquiring small, strategically significant portions of the Crestwood's debt, slowly positioning ourselves for a surgical strike on the controlling interest. I treated the acquisition like a complex military operation. Phase 1, infiltration, analyzing the books. Phase 2, surveillance tracking the major shareholders. Phase 3, surgical strike, the final tender offer. My years in the Navy, managing multi-million-dollar budgets and coordinating complex logistics under pressure, had trained me for this intellectual blood sport. The civilian world's corporate warfare felt slow and predictable by comparison. I remember reviewing the final purchase proposal. The current owners, descendants of the original founders, were desperate. They viewed the resort as a legacy, not an asset, and were emotionally blind to the bleeding balance sheet. Merit Holdings offered them a respectable, silent exit, preserving their public image while stripping them of their liability. The day of the closing was unnervingly quiet. I sat in a conference room with Marcus and a team of bankers, none of whom knew I was the ultimate beneficial owner. The documents were thick, smelling of expensive paper and fresh ink. When it came time for the final signature, Marcus presented the papers to me, a faint, knowing smirk on his face. I signed the name of the shell company's designated representative, a signature that legally bound Merit Holdings to the ownership of the resort. It was anticlimactic. There was no explosion of triumph, no champagne, just the quiet scratch of a pen, signifying the transference of power. I looked down at the deed, a simple piece of paper that represented not just prime Long Island real estate, but 15 years of sacrifice, discipline, and simmering resolve. I didn't just own a resort. I owned the symbol of my exclusion. I had bought the cage they tried to trap me in. The satisfaction was profound, but it was purely intellectual. It wasn't about the money. It was about the undeniable proof of capability. I had achieved the financial power to stand above the very institutions that had dismissed me. Now came the final phase, the public unveiling. The execution had to be flawless and devastating. I needed to ensure that my parents, and especially Mr. Henderson, would be present, standing on the very stage of their own downfall. My research showed that the Crestwood's sudden sale would cause a ripple of panic among the old guard. They would mourn the loss of tradition and fear the unknown intentions of the new, anonymous owner. This was my leverage. I instructed Merit Holdings to immediately announce a high-profile sponsorship and preservation gala. The stated purpose, to celebrate the resort's history and raise funds for necessary, immediate renovations. The subtext, carefully leaked to the society columns, was that the new owner was seeking to preserve the exclusive ambience that the old families cherished. I knew my father's ego. He prided himself on being the champion of tradition and the arbiter of taste in his circle. He would see the gala as an opportunity to publicly align himself with the resort's supposed saviors. Ensuring his continued status, the invitations were a masterpiece of psychological warfare. They were meticulously crafted, referencing the Rourke family's long association with the resort and subtly suggesting that his presence, and perhaps a toast, would be essential to lending the event legitimacy. We even ensured that Mr. Henderson, now merely an operational manager under new ownership, was tasked with personally confirming my parents' attendance. I imagined Henderson, still puffed up with his own self-importance, oblivious that he was coordinating the party for the woman he had once deemed too low-class to occupy one of his rooms. I spent days planning my own entrance and presentation. I needed to look successful, yes, but more importantly, I needed to look like someone who had earned every thread of my attire, every ounce of my confidence. I wasn't going as their daughter. I was going as the proprietor, the architect of the new order. I decided to wear something simple, tailored, and undeniably powerful, no ostentatious jewelry. Just the quiet confidence of someone who controls the room without needing to demand attention. The final piece of the trap was the timing. My father's toast, I mandated, had to occur immediately before the new owner was introduced. He would be standing on the stage, delivering his predictable, condescending rhetoric, basking in the perceived glory of his social standing, Just moments before, I delivered the ultimate blow. I rehearsed the sequence of events in my mind, not for fear of faltering, but to ensure the emotional impact would be maximized. I wanted the realization to hit them not as a slow burn, but as a sudden, stunning collapse of their reality. 15 years ago, I drove away from that estate with a deep sense of shame, determined to earn my own worth. Now, I was driving toward the Crestwood, ready to cash in that self-worth for the greatest satisfaction of all. Absolute, undeniable vindication. The game was set. The pieces were in place. I just had to wait for the curtain to rise. I felt zero nervousness, only the focused anticipation of a commander watching the final approach of a perfectly planned operation. Tomorrow night, the reckoning would begin. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant, muffled sound of waves hitting the shore of the same ocean I had stared at 15 years ago, tears stinging my eyes, masking the shame of rejection. Tonight, the only sting I felt was the dry sharpness of the high-end champagne I held, untouched, in my hand. I walked into the Crestwood's grand ballroom as the unseen architect of the evening. The place was a monument to exclusionary wealth. Towering marble columns, gilded cornices, and chandeliers that probably cost more than my first 2 years of Navy salary combined. Every surface gleamed with the polish of inherited privilege. But I wasn't admiring it. I was cataloging my inventory. Every square foot, every priceless piece of art hanging on the walls belonged to me. I was dressed in a tailored, charcoal suit, professional and understated, designed to blend into the background until the precise moment I decided to command the foreground. I moved through the crowd, a silent observer in my own trap. The air hummed with the self-congratulatory chatter of the very people who defined the social stratum I had spent my life escaping. I spotted them immediately, standing near the main stage, radiating the familiar, suffocating aura of effortless entitlement. My father, impeccably dressed in a tuxedo, was holding court, his silver hair catching the light just so. My mother, draped in a diamond necklace that had likely funded a small Navy ship, laughed, a soundless, practiced laugh at something one of their associates said. They looked exactly as they had 15 years prior, untouchable, unconcerned, and utterly convinced of their own superiority. Beside them stood Mr. Henderson, the resort manager. He was older now, his face a little puffier, but the look in his eyes, that subtle institutional snobbery, was exactly the same. He was beaming at my parents, clearly thrilled to have the Rourke family lending their prestige to his Save the Crestwood Gala. He had no idea he was smiling at his executioners. I felt nothing as I watched them, no residual pain, no lingering resentment, just the cold, analytical focus of a predator watching its quarry walk into the snare. I had channeled every ounce of humiliation I felt that day on the phone into this moment. The Navy had taught me patience, logistics, and the devastating power of a well-timed strike. The dinner concluded, and the room grew quiet as the master of ceremonies introduced the evening's main speaker, my father. He strode to the microphone with the natural confidence of a man who had never doubted his right to be heard. The spotlight hit him, and he adjusted his cufflinks, clearing his throat dramatically. "Friends, neighbors, and fellow guardians of tradition," he began, his voice booming slightly over the sound system. It was the same voice that had dismissed my enlistment as a cowardly escape. He launched into a speech about Crestwood's history, its vital role in maintaining the integrity of the community, and the importance of preserving institutions that valued lineage over fleeting trends. He spoke about the need to keep the resort exclusive, referring vaguely to the recent financial difficulties as merely a temporary lapse caused by a lack of discernment in the previous management's clientele selection. I felt a low, steady burn of recognition. His words were a direct echo of the philosophy that had locked me out. He was celebrating the very snobbery that had led Mr. Henderson to refuse me a room because I was wearing a uniform earned through service, not inherited through birth. "We must ensure," my father declared, raising his glass of champagne high, "that the Crestwood remains a sanctuary, a place where the standards of excellence are not compromised by the inclusion of those who simply cannot appreciate the finer details of life. We are here tonight to save our heritage, to protect our legacy, and to keep the riffraff out." A wave of polite, appreciative laughter swept the room. My mother nodded approvingly, her expression radiating pride. Mr. Henderson clapped vigorously, his face flushed with self-importance. That was my cue. I had waited 15 years for this precise, arrogant sentence. My father took a long, self-satisfied sip of champagne, lowering his glass. I didn't wait for him to finish. I moved swiftly, purposefully, walking directly onto the stage from the side entrance. The sudden, unexpected intrusion froze the room. My father, startled, lowered his glass halfway, his brow furrowed in annoyance at being interrupted. I took the microphone from the stand, my hand steady, my presence immediately commanding the silence. "Thank you, Father," I said, my voice clear and amplified, cutting through the stunned quiet. I paused, letting my eyes sweep the room, settling briefly on Mr. Henderson, who was now staring at me with a look of confused dread. "Thank you for that eloquent defense of tradition," I repeated, the phrase dripping with irony, "but I must respectfully inform you all that tonight, tradition ends." The silence that followed was heavier than the mahogany table from my youth. It was a silence born of confusion and mounting alarm. No one in this room was used to being contradicted, much less by an unknown woman interrupting a Rourke family speech. My father finally found his voice, laced with the familiar, patronizing tone he reserved for underlings and embarrassing family members. "Sarah, what in the world are you doing? This is not the time for one of your theatrics. Please step aside." I ignored him completely. My gaze was fixed on Mr. Henderson. The color had drained from his face. He recognized the name now, the Navy daughter they had dismissed. But the recognition was incomplete. He only saw the ghost of the girl he had snubbed. "My name is Sarah Rourke," I announced, stating my full name for the first time in the presence of this crowd in 15 years. "And I am here to discuss the future of the Crestwood." I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a simple folded manila document, the deed of sale, executed just last week through Merit Holdings. I held it up, not dramatically, but simply as a statement of fact. As many of you know, this gala was organized to save this resort from financial ruin. What you may not know is that the financial ruin has already occurred. The acquisition process has been completed. I let the words hang in the air, watching the realization dawn slowly, agonizingly, across the faces of the old guard. "Through Merit Holdings," I continued, my voice gaining a low, powerful resonance, "I now own the controlling interest in the Crestwood Resort. Effective immediately, I own this property, every column, every chandelier, and every square foot of beach frontage." The room erupted in a chaotic murmur, a cascade of disbelief, gasps, and frantic whispers. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. My father's face, usually so composed, was a mask of intellectual shock, slowly transitioning into profound, public humiliation. He looked at me, not with anger, but with the devastating realization that I hadn't just succeeded. I had succeeded against him, using the very tools he valued, finance and strategy, to dismantle his world. Mr. Henderson looked like he was about to faint. He stumbled forward, whispering hoarsely, "That's impossible. Ms. Rourke, Merit Holdings is a private equity firm. They're based in Delaware, .. I cut him off, a ghost of a smile touching my lips. "Yes, Mr. Henderson. Merit Holdings is a very good private equity firm, and I am its sole owner." I turned back to the audience, allowing them a moment to absorb the magnitude of the reversal. The daughter they had mocked for choosing the Navy the path for, those who couldn't handle real responsibility, had just bought the sanctuary of their privilege. "My father spoke tonight about tradition and lineage," I said, my tone shifting from strategic announcement to final judgment. "He spoke about keeping the riffraff out. 15 years ago, Mr. Henderson here ensured that Aja, serving member of the United States Navy, on leave after a successful deployment, was denied a room at this resort because my uniform did not fit the expected clientele." I let the revelation hang over the room like a verdict. The whispers died down. The air felt charged with their collective shame. "The Crestwood, under my ownership, will no longer operate on the principle of lineage," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "It will operate on merit." I outlined the immediate changes, my words sharp and decisive, like a commander issuing orders. "First, Mr. Henderson, you are relieved of your duties, effective immediately. Your severance package will be delivered to your residence tomorrow morning, along with a formal apology from the Crestwood, not from me, but from the institution, for your past discriminatory practices." Henderson simply nodded, defeated, unable to speak. "Second, and most importantly," I continued, looking directly at my parents, who stood frozen in their defeat, "the entire exclusive art collection housed in the West Wing, valued at approximately $70 million, will be liquidated over the next 60 days. Every penny from that sale will be used to establish the Crestwood Merit Foundation." A gasp rippled through the room. The art collection was the crown jewel of their snobbery. "This foundation," I explained, "will provide educational scholarships and housing assistance exclusively for enlisted military, families and veterans transitioning back into civilian life. Those who serve our nation, those my father deemed riffraff, will now be the beneficiaries of this institution's wealth. I watched my father recoil slightly, as if struck. The money meant less to him than the public. Absolute destruction of his ideology. I hadn't just bought his resort. I had bought his platform and repurposed it to validate the life he scorned. I stepped away from the microphone, the silence of the room now a profound, echoing confirmation of my victory. I walked straight to my parents. My mother looked away, unable to meet my eyes. My father, however, stared at me, his disappointment finally replaced by a raw, naked astonishment. "Why?" he managed, his voice barely a whisper. "Why this theatrical display, Sarah? You could have simply enjoyed your success." I stood tall, the weight of the suit and the weight of my empire settling comfortably on my shoulders. I finally met his gaze, and for the first time in my life, I felt no need to prove anything to him. "Because," I said, my voice low and final, meant only for him and my mother, 15 years ago. "You taught me that the only language this world respects is power. You taught me that service was a mark of shame. Tonight, I simply translated that lesson into action." I didn't wait for their response. I turned and walked away from the stage, leaving them standing in the ruins of their tradition, bathed in the spotlight of their own public humiliation. The closure wasn't a burst of angry vindication. It was a profound, cold certainty. The pain was gone. I had not only proven them wrong, I had acquired the power to ensure that no one else who chose the path of service would ever be dismissed by the institutions they held dear. I had bought my freedom, and the price was the Crestwood.